Good evening, everyone. Hi. For those of you who don't know me, as David said, I'm Julie, one of the team here, so my pleasure to be speaking to us tonight. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a bit of a sucker for a good love story. Whether it's the sort of story that we find in a Disney classic like Beauty and the Beast, or the more subtle underlying love and commitment that underpins the epic story we find in The Lord of the Rings between Aragorn and Arwen. Or the real life stories that we see and hear about, maybe even live in ordinary everyday life between people just like us. So here's me with my lovely husband, Chris. I told him he was going to feature. He never quite knows what I'm going to come up with when I'm speaking. It's one of the things that I always love to ask couples whose weddings I have the joy of doing. How did you two get together? Now, of course, it's true to say that not every love story has a happy ending. Before I really knew and understood the fullness of the story of The Lord of the Rings, I always felt rather sad that Aragorn didn't pick up on the interest that was clearly being shown to him by Eowyn, another of the female heroines in the story, because I just didn't get his heart already belonged to Arwen. And actually, confession time, I rather liked Aragorn myself. But I know that this is because he reminds me of Jesus. Jesus, one partner in the greatest love story that we're ever to be told or to be lived. A story and a wedding that we're all going to get to be part of. The wedding where we, the church, the bride of Christ, will be forever united with Christ, our bridegroom. And you can read about the promise of this wedding in the very last pages of the Bible in the book of Revelation. And I can promise you there will be a happy ending to this story. But it's also true to say that not every love story starts out the way it ends. In some cultures, even today, there are marriages that are arranged, set up with very little thought for whatever feelings either partner may or may not have for each other. And I think this was certainly true in the early stages of the story that we're going to be looking at tonight. If you've been around the last couple of weeks, you'll know that we're in a mini sermon series based on the book of Ruth, which is found early on in the Old Testament. And if you've missed either of the first two sermons, they're well worth a catch up on because Vicky and Tom have done a great job with the series so far. But here's a brief recap to set the scene for chapter 3, this evening's part of the story. A family from Bethlehem went to live in neighbouring Moab during a time of famine. Sadly, Elimelech, the husband, and the two sons died whilst they were there, leaving Naomi, the wife, and her two Moabite daughters-in-law widows. Naomi decides to return to her homeland, the promised land of Judah, and one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, insists on going with her, even though there are no guarantees at all that Naomi will be able to provide for her needs there. And they arrive back in Bethlehem just as the barley harvest is beginning. That was chapter 1. Then in chapter 2, the story moves on. Ruth goes out to glean in the fields, picking up whatever leftover grain she can find. And she just so happens to find herself gleaning in a field belonging to Boaz. Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech, her deceased father-in-law. Boaz makes inquiries about her and hears all about the kindness she's shown to Naomi. So he, in turn, shows kindness to her, providing her with food and drink and encouraging his workers to accidentally on purpose drop and leave stalks for Ruth to pick up. Well, when Naomi sees how much grain Ruth brings home and hears how Boaz encouraged her to stay with his workers till they finish harvesting, she can't believe their good fortune. Having returned to her people empty, hope begins to dawn again in Naomi's heart. So that was chapter 2. But before we move on to chapter 3, tonight's reading, there are just a couple of things I want to highlight that are really important for us to note. The first is the use of the Hebrew word hesed, which Tom spoke brilliantly on last week. Hesed meaning loyal love. We saw it acted out in chapter 1 in the commitment that Ruth made to stay with her mother-in-law. And we saw it in chapter 2 in the generosity shown by Boaz to Ruth. And this evening, we're going to see it in the way that Naomi is proactive in looking out for the needs of her daughter-in-law. Then the second thing to note is this little verse from Ruth chapter 2 that says so much about the way that Ruth, a Moabite who grew up worshipping other gods, so wholeheartedly turned to Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, and about the way that the Lord so wholeheartedly welcomed her. Hear what Boaz had said to Ruth. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Isn't that a lovely picture of God? The shadow of God's wings is the title for this next chapter of the story, chapter 3. And it's a chapter that breaks down neatly into 3 scenes. So we're going to read and then look at each of the scenes in turn. So scene 1, at Naomi's house. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you'll be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he'll be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, and don't let him know that you're there until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. Well, Naomi knows that she and Ruth are in a precarious situation. As widows, they're very vulnerable. But thankfully, Jewish law made provision for widows in several different ways. One of them we've already seen in the rules around gleaning. Widows were allowed to glean what they could behind the harvesters. And a second was in the role of the guardian redeemer, or kinsman redeemer, as some versions translate it. Jewish law stipulated that if a man died leaving a widow but no children, then the widow would marry the dead man's brother, and the firstborn child would belong to the dead brother. This was so that the family name would be continued. Well, you may remember the question asked of Jesus once about a woman who ended up marrying 7 brothers. Can you imagine it? Whose wife would she be at the resurrection? But back to Jewish law, if there were no brothers, as was true for Ruth at this time, then the nearest relative, a guardian redeemer, could be asked to take on the widow. He didn't have to take on this responsibility, he could pass it by, in which case the next nearest relative could be approached. And if no one chose to help, it would probably mean the widow living in poverty for the rest of her life. And that was a pretty desperate outcome for anyone, particularly in those days. It's why I think the Bible has so much to say about God's concern and care for orphans and widows. So Naomi sets about seeing what could be done to provide for Ruth, and she's very intentional in the actions that she takes. She takes initiative. And if we're thinking about what we can learn from this story, what we can take away, here's the first thing about taking initiative. Ruth is to bathe, put on perfumed oil and her best clothes, and go to Boaz. In this, Ruth will be signalling that her period of mourning is over and letting Boaz know both her availability and the seriousness of her intentions. It's a risky plan, but it's worth a go. So much could go wrong. Boaz might reject Ruth's advances and mock her, humiliate her by gratifying his own sexual desires. Naomi and Ruth could find that they lose the favour they've already gained in Boaz's eyes. So Ruth's willingness to go along with Naomi's plan is pretty impressive. She's already shown such courage and strength of character in what's gone before. And once again, she demonstrates her commitment and her trust in Naomi. And so we come to scene 2, at the threshing floor. So she, Ruth, went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law had told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer for our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it's true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who's more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, "No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl that you're wearing and hold it out." When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. Now, the threshing floor was the place where valuable grain was separated from worthless chaff. You may be familiar with the expression about separating the wheat from the chaff, and this is where it comes from. The work was done at night, and clearly there was a social dimension to it as well, because we hear about Boaz eating and drinking and being in good spirits before he then goes to lie down and get some rest. Now, it just so happens that he lies down in a quiet corner of the threshing floor, just as earlier in the story, Ruth had happened to glean in his field. And we can see here the sovereignty of God worked out in the little things, as well as in the bigger things. Then Ruth puts the next part of Naomi's plan into action. Now, there's no doubt that there are sexual overtones present in the act of uncovering feet, but I'm not sure that Naomi is suggesting a full-blown sexual encounter for her daughter-in-law. That would seem to go against everything we know of both Ruth and Boaz being such honourable people. But rather, Ruth's actions in uncovering Boaz's feet might be understood to be a non-verbal, customary means of requesting marriage. I wonder if anybody wants to try that. Fortunately, Boaz, after he gets over his initial shock, seems to get the message. He totally understands what Ruth's asking, and he responds favourably. In fact, he even seems humbled and surprised that Ruth has chosen him and not gone after younger men. So here's our second takeaway this evening. He shows honour, takes initiative, shows honour. Boaz honours Ruth. And in a culture where women, especially foreign women, were looked down on, this really was quite remarkable. I love this little verse made famous from a scene of the film Chariots of Fire, for those of you who've seen it. It's from 1 Samuel chapter 2. "Those who honour me, I will honour. Those who honour me, I will honour." Boaz was an honourable man. Not only did he do what was right, but he did it right away. He didn't hang about. He would have had no idea that the choice he made that day to honour Ruth would have such far-reaching consequences, that his name would be included in the genealogy of Jesus Christ himself. More about that next week. I mustn't steal Chris's thunder. The ripples of our choices go far and wide, and God often uses the little decisions we make to carry out his big plans. So it's good, and it can be really encouraging for us to have our eyes open to see how and when this is happening in our lives, because it can really help us build our faith and trust in God. But back to our story. And scene 3, we're back at Naomi's home. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." It's the morning after the night before. And Ruth returns home with a generous gift of barley, a symbol of Boaz's commitment. But there's one more moment of suspense. Boaz is a man of integrity, determined to do everything properly. He knows he's not the nearest guardian redeemer, so he's gone to town to check out whether the relative who has a closer claim than him wants to take Ruth on. We'll hear how that unfolds next week, but spoiler alert, there is a happy ending for Ruth and Boaz. So here's our third takeaway for this evening. The person of God has integrity. Integrity. All of the 3 characters features in our story so far have integrity. They all act on behalf of others, even when they're under no obligation to do so. Their motives are good, they're pure. And you know, it's really, really important that we get into the habit of examining our motivations, even if it might sometimes be a bit uncomfortable. To ask ourselves the question, why are we doing what we're doing? And to be honest with ourselves and with God as we listen to the answer. Naomi and Ruth have done everything they can. Now they must wait, and they must trust that God will work on their behalf. And that perhaps brings us back to the biggest lesson for us in the whole book of Ruth, that interplay between divine and human actions. We take the initiative, we do our bit, just as Naomi and Ruth did, and God steps in and does his bit. It's not about us waiting around passively hoping that something might happen. It's about us seizing the initiative when an opportunity presents itself and then seeing what God does with it. We, that's Chris and I, saw an amazing example of this around this time last year. It was Easter Monday, and we were driving north to Durham to celebrate a 70th birthday with some old friends. As we drove, we were chatting and praying about different things, and some other old friends who we hadn't seen for years came to mind. They used to come to St. Michael's many years ago. In fact, they were youth leaders when our kids were teenagers. So because they come to mind, I dropped them a message just to say, "Hello, and how are you?" Almost straight away, the answer came back. "Thanks for your message. Really lovely to hear from you. Unfortunately, we're doing really, really badly. The COVID adolescent mental health crisis has hit us very hard. We're barely clinging on, to be honest." They went on to tell us how 2 of their 3 children were seriously unwell, the eldest daughter having been in hospital for over a year. Well, you never quite know, do you, when you message someone what's going to come back. Anyway, we got it that our friends were struggling, and so we offered to meet up just to listen to them and to pray with them. And they came round the next week and poured out everything that had happened. And you know, it was heartbreaking to listen to. And then halfway through the evening, they came out with a question for us. Would we consider having their eldest daughter to live with us when she was discharged from hospital? For a variety of complicated reasons, it wasn't going to be possible for her to go home to live with them at this time, and they were desperate to try and find a home for her. Well, it wasn't a question we were expecting, and honestly, my initial internal response was, "I really don't think so." Some of you will know that Chris and I completely believe in sharing our home. We've had the privilege of hosting a number of young adults over the years and have been hugely blessed in doing this. But I knew that this was probably going to be my last year in full-time ministry, and we kind of already decided that we probably wouldn't host anyone this year. But as we sat listening to our friends, exploring what it might look like if we were to say yes, these verses from Isaiah 58 kept going round in my mind. And they were verses that I'd really felt God speaking to me through in Lent last year, so just a few weeks before this happened. And they speak about the nature of true fasting from Isaiah 58. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? As I lay in bed that night, not sleeping, all this going round in my mind, something else kept coming back. Just a short phrase from a sermon that Si had preached the previous Sunday evening in the first of our sermon series, Embracing Justice. And I'd picked up this phrase as we'd moved into a time of ministry. And this was it. Who will you stand in the gap for? Who will you stand in the gap for? Somehow we, Chris and I, knew as we sat and prayed about our friend's request over the next few days, that unexpected as it was, our answer was going to be yes. This was something we really believed God was calling us to do. And whilst it may not always have been easy, once again, we've been blessed. We're richer for having responded to this call to open our home, to be able to provide shelter for someone in desperate need. God's in the business of providing refuge for those who come to shelter under the shadow of his wings. And sometimes he calls us to be part of the outworking of his purposes. Naomi took a risk in formulating her plan. Ruth took a risk in going to Boaz that night. Our friends took a risk in asking us their bold question. But in taking the initiative as they did, they opened the way for God to work in some surprising and unexpected ways. Because here's the thing. Very often when we take initiative, we find that God's already been at work, preparing the ground. And it's completely amazing when that happens. Human and divine action go together. So we need to seize the initiative when the opportunity presents itself, because God may well have been intentional about presenting us with that opportunity. Then one final thought. The overarching story of the book of Ruth points us to Jesus. Jesus, who's our kinsman redeemer, our guardian redeemer. Jesus, who came to rescue us when we were in desperate need. Jesus, who restores our hope when all seems lost. Who purchases us to be his own beloved, treasured possession and offers us shelter under the shadow of his wings. Jesus, who's here with us now, calling us to himself, wooing us with his love. So how will you respond to his call today? Will you let him love you? Will you let him use you to reveal his love to others?